Over the dense green hills of North Vietnam, Captain Ray Donovan was flying F-4 Phantoms with the 388. On final run for the target, when the sky broke a rule no one wanted to break that month. It was late spring, 1970, and his flight was threading the low corridor toward an industrial complex near the coast. Slow, low, strict. The kind of mission where every instrument reading and second of timing mattered. Radios were quiet. The formation crested a shallow ridge, and the lead F-105, a big gray thunderhead of metal, took the first burst of shrapnel and rolled out of the sky in a single, stunned instant. The sound carried across the squadron. A distant, wrong silence where a plane had been. Men on the deck saw the flash and felt the sudden, practiced hollow that follows a loss. There was no time for rhetoric. There was only the hard fact that a radar-guided sight had found and engaged a target that had been flying low and careful and still been hit. That loss made the problem real in a way briefings and charts never could. Air defenses were now killing planes even when crews flew the textbook profiles. Donovan felt that loss in the pit of his stomach. He'd flown enough suppression missions to know the choreography. A pre-sweep, a baiting pass by the wild weasels to get radars to light up, then the strike element in behind. But this hit had come without a predictable radar activation, without a prolonged search pattern. It was the kind of engagement where the enemy's emitters had been either cleverly concealed, pulsed on only briefly, or oriented in such a way that traditional electronic surveillance missed them until it was too late. For men who made a living dodging invisible beams, that unpredictability was the one thing you could not accept. It demanded new senses. 2 days after the strike, Donovan climbed into his Phantom and went back to flying the lines with a new sort of attention. He and his backseater, Captain Lewis Parker, had already been watching instruments the way a mechanic watches gauges, an idle habit for some, an obsession for others. That morning, as they ran low-level transit runs toward a different target, Donovan executed a deliberate 200-foot dip, not a dive, a small, precise decrease in altitude designed to probe the envelope below treetop level. On the flight recorder, the action looked almost nothing, a tiny squiggle among hours of trace. But as they rewound the altimeter strip in the debrief, both men stopped on the same millimeter of ink where the trace showed a sharp, short spike that did not line up with the ground return. It was a half-second anomaly, the sort of cursory blip maintenance notes often ignore. Only this time it duplicated on a separate sortie taken 3 days earlier on a different heading. 2 independent flights, separated by time and place, showing the same oddity in the same context. A small, repeatable spike when the aircraft executed a particular low-altitude dip. The equipment they were looking at was mundane and universally trusted. The radar altimeter. It was not classified as an intelligence sensor. Its job was simple and life-preserving. Measure height above terrain by sending a microwave pulse down and timing the echo. The Phantom's altimeter worked in the 4.2 to 4.4 GHz band, designed to give clean, reliable readings at low altitude for terrain following and safe egress. It had never been asked officially to detect enemy emitters. Electromagnetic physics, however, does not respect paperwork. When a high-gain emitter like a missile guidance radar was powered up in the field, its parabolic dish throwing a fan-shaped lobe across the sky, the local electromagnetic environment changed. The altimeter's pulse and the enemy radar's emissions could interact. Reflections and cross-coupled lobes could create transient echoes that the altimeter's receiver would register as a spike superimposed on the normal ground return. In plain terms, the Phantom's own altimeter, used the right way, could reveal the presence of an otherwise concealed radar by registering a characteristic blip when the aircraft executed a precise motion. Donovan did what pilots do when they find a loose thread. He pulled gently to see how the fabric held. He and Parker began running controlled passes, deliberately varying heading, speed, and dip depth to see when the blips showed and when they did not. They documented everything: timestamps, inertial fixes, altimeter traces, cockpit film, and they repeated the motion over multiple radials. The pattern hardened quickly. At cruise speeds roughly between 480 and 520 knots and altitudes in the 300 to 500-foot range above trees, a rapid 200 to 250-foot descent produced a spike on the altimeter trace when flown along certain bearings. The spike's amplitude varied with distance and orientation to the ground emitter, but the timing and presence of the spike were consistent for a given radial. Fly the same radial again with the same maneuver, and the blip returned in roughly the same window. Fly a different radial and it disappeared. That repeatability was not anecdote. It was operationally useful consistency. Why did it work? The simple physics answer was that the altimeter's transmitted pulse and the active radar's emission interacted via scattering and reflection. SAM radar's dish produces concentrated lobes. Those lobes, when struck by the moving aircraft and adjacent terrain, scatter energy back in odd ways. The altimeter's receiver, tuned for the minuscule echo of its own pulse, picked up that perturbation as a distinct transient. On an analog trace, it would show up as a spike, short as a heartbeat, and only visible if someone was watching the feed on a second-by-second basis. The sophistication in Donovan's realization was not technical wizardry. It was a tactical repurposing of an existing sensor. Instead of buying new kit or waiting for SIGINT to catch up, he proposed using what every Phantom carried and flying it in such a way that the aircraft itself asked a question of the electromagnetic environment and got an answer. Turning that potential into practice required procedures and discipline. Donovan and Parker took field notes and built a detection checklist. Approach the radial at low level. Confirm safe terrain clearance with maps and prior reconnaissance. Execute a 200-foot dip holding the aircraft stable for no more than 2 seconds. Mark the time precisely with the onboard chronometer and record the altimeter trace. Do not linger. The dip was a probe. It was never intended as a search run. The timing mattered. At 500 knots, a half-second spike equated to roughly 70 to 80 meters of forward travel, enough to narrow a search area for a strike element, but not precise enough to be a lone source targeting fix. That meant the detection run had to be paired with rapid handoff procedures. Mark grid coordinates, communicate succinctly to the incoming wild weasel or strike flight, and preserve the escape profile immediately after the dip. The maneuver carried risk: low-level, high-speed flight, the threat of small arms and AAA, and the possibility of false positives that wasted ordnance. But in an environment where radars could lie dormant for hours and then kill in a heartbeat, risk-reward calculations favored working with any sensor that provided even a narrow window of actionable information. Skeptics were quick to test Donovan's claim. Electronics officers warned of spurious reflections from water, cliffs, or dense cloud. Intelligence units pointed out that decoys and altered emitter orientations might produce misleading spikes. Maintenance worried about intentionally driving the altimeter into unfamiliar reception conditions. Donovan answered each concern by tightening his methodology and producing corroboration. On 3 separate occasions within a month, an altimeter spike recorded during a Donovan dip corresponded to imagery, reconnaissance photos taken at first light that showed freshly cleared spots, service tracks, and in one case, a radar dish partially obscured by foliage exactly where the trace predicted. In another case, a wild weasel flight acting on Donovan's coordinates visually confirmed a radar site and recorded the dish being damaged by follow-up strikes. Those confirmations transformed the method from curiosity to tactic. The spike was not a parlor trick. It was a signed note from the electromagnetic environment announcing where a threat slept. Donovan understood the limits as clearly as he understood the capability. The signature was faint, easily masked by terrain clutter or weather. It required disciplined flying and meticulous cross-checking. It would never replace radar warning receivers, signal intercepts, or the seasoned judgment of the Weasel crews who baited and tracked emitters directly. What it did do was give crews another sense in the dark, a quick, repeatable way to find powered but otherwise silent sites before they fired. In a theater that had learned to hide, that short 2-second spike sometimes made the difference between a pilot returning to base and a crew writing a report that began with the words, "Observed loss." By the time Donovan left the cockpit that week, he and Parker had refined the dip into a precise tactical profile and written the first draft of a how-to card. It would be handwritten and mimeographed at first, laughed at by some, adopted by others, and gradually baked into a set of pre-sweep procedures. The key fact Donovan put at the top of his card, clear and simple, was the promise. Use the altimeter spike to find emitters that do not show up on other sensors. That promise, proven in the hard light after losses and confirmed by reconnaissance, was the hinge on which his whole method would swing into broader use. They took the idea out of the notebook and into practice in earnest. After the initial confirmations, Donovan and Parker stopped treating the altimeter spike as a curiosity and began running methodical trials to turn it into a tactic. The work was simple in principle and tedious in execution. Fly prescribed radials. Make controlled 200 to 250-foot dips at specified ground speeds, record the altimeter trace and cockpit film, and log the precise inertial fix. They logged run after run in late June 1970, sometimes 6 sorties in a row, and compared traces side by side. The pattern that had seemed random at first smoothed into rules. The spike showed up reliably at speeds between roughly 480 and 520 knots and altitudes between about 300 and 500 feet above the vegetation line. The useful window for a clear, usable spike was narrowly timed, typically a 0.4 to 0.8 second transient, so timing devices and synchronized clocks mattered as much as flying skill. Turning an ink spike into coordinates required equipment and discipline. Radar altimeters measured height with pulse timing. In Donovan's Phantom, the altimeter trace recorded on an analog strip and also could be cross-referenced against the onboard inertial navigation system and film-timed markers. Parker became the mission's data officer. He synchronized the altimeter trace to the inertial time base and then used the film's time markings to translate that instant into a latitude-longitude fix. At 500 knots, a single second of forward travel covered roughly 150 to 160 meters. The typical spike, therefore, produced a position uncertainty box of a few hundred meters along track and somewhat tighter across track. That was enough for a wild Weasel pilot to push his seekers or for a strike element to make a targeted follow-up pass. Donovan's team developed a shorthand. The dip gave you the neighborhood. The Weasels would do the door knock. Word of the method spread informally through briefings at the 388th. Donovan insisted that the technique be taught with caveats. Never act on a single spike without corroboration, always combine with other intelligence when possible, and never linger inside the hostile envelope after a detection. To build corroboration, he pushed for coordinated missions. Donovan's Phantom would fly the detection run, then vector an F-105G or another Phantom configured for suppression to the estimated coordinates for a targeted sweep. On several early coordinated sorties, the sequence worked precisely. Altimeter spike, position, handoff, a quick Weasel run, and then a strike. Post-strike reconnaissance imagery often proved the result. Disrupted installations, signs of blast on camouflage nets, or, in the clearest case, a damaged radar reflector seen in morning overflight photographs. Those debrief packages, trace, film, inertial fix, strike photos, were the currency Donovan needed to convince operations control that this was more than luck. The technical community responded too. Donovan had forwarded sample traces to the avionics shop and a small signal analysis team attached to 7th Air Force. The technicians confirmed what the pilots suspected. The altimeter's receiver could detect perturbations produced by active narrow-beam emitters in the local electromagnetic field. In lay terms, the radar dish's high-gain lobe scattered energy that, when combined with the Phantom's own transmitted pulse, created an anomalous reflection. Engineers noted that the altimeter operated in a band near 4.3 GHz and that certain SAM guidance heads and fire control systems produced side lobes and harmonics that could couple into that band under particular geometry. The conclusion was practical rather than theoretical. The overlap in frequency content and the right angle of incidence could create a measurable spike in the altimeter return. The engineers began to advise pilots about which approach geometries and relative bearings produced the cleanest signature. But the method was not without its problems. False positives were common if crews did not control approach parameters tightly. Reflections from river surfaces, sheer rock faces, and even metallic infrastructure like bridges created spikes that mimicked the signature of an emitter. Weather degraded returns, and precipitation could mask the tiny perturbation entirely. Terrain multipath, when signals bounced between the aircraft, the terrain, and a distant emitter, sometimes produced echo trains that made trace interpretation ambiguous. To mitigate these, Donovan's team refined standard operating procedures. They emphasized repeatability. A spike only counted if it reoccurred on the same radial under similar approach conditions. They added quick cross-checks, a second dip a few seconds later, a slightly different heading, or a corroborating radio intercept from SIGINT assets. When multiple indicators aligned, the confidence level rose from possible to probable, and then to actionable. Enemy adaptation was the other constant. Within weeks of the first confirmed strikes, intelligence reports showed that some emitter units began to alter their behavior. They powered up only briefly, toggled beam orientation, or used lower-power intermittent pulses to reduce detectability. Some sites rotated their dishes irregularly, or used masking foliage to reduce direct reflections. That forced Donovan and other crews to improvise. Rather than a single dip, detection profiles diversified into short sequences, 2 dips separated by a half-second, slight lateral wiggles during descent, or shallow S-shaped passes to change the geometry of incidence. These refinements increased the chance that a powered but evasive radar would produce at least one usable perturbation in the altimeter record. The crews learned that sophistication on both sides translated into a tactical chess match. The more the defenders hid, the more the attackers refined their probes. Training became crucial. Donovan and Parker built a training syllabus that started on the ground. New crews watched annotated traces and learned to distinguish emitter signatures from terrain clutter. They practiced timed dips over friendly ranges where known emitters and reflectors were catalogued, first in the daytime, then under tactical conditions. On the range, the effect was cleaner. Controlled emitters could be powered on and off to allow pilots to see the signature appear and vanish. From simulation and range work, crews graduated to live theater runs under supervision, where a senior crew would mentor younger teams on real radials. The learning curve was steep. Competent crews could perform a detection run, hand off coordinates, and withdraw within under a minute. Poorly trained crews produced ambiguous traces and wasted ordnance. Operational doctrine absorbed the technique slowly and cautiously. Headquarters issued guidance that the altimeter dip method could be used as an auxiliary detection procedure and recommended integrating it into pre-sweep profiles. It was never intended to replace active electronic reconnaissance, but it could fill gaps when SIGINT and RWR systems were blind, or when the enemy's intermittent emissions created too brief a window for other sensors. The method found its best niche as an early warning measure. It was a low-cost, immediate way to produce a target cue in contested airspace where waiting for the enemy to reveal himself was no longer safe. Results proved its value. Between July and October of 1970, coordinated missions that used altimeter dip handoffs showed a measurable uptick in successful suppression outcomes in sectors where the method was applied. Operation reports logged multiple instances in which follow-up strikes based on Donovan's calls led to damaged radar arrays or disrupted fire control trailers. The exact numbers were messy. War always is. But metrics in theater files showed reduced SAM engagement rates in several contested corridors after the method's adoption, and lower loss rates on certain suppression missions where handoffs were precise and quick. For the crews in the air, the value was visceral. One more tool in an environment where any additional sense could be the difference between returning home and becoming another line in a manifest. The technique also seeded engineering interest in purpose-built sensors. The concept, using a platform's own sensors to detect foreign emitters indirectly, would feed into projects that later explored passive detection suites and smart altimeter processing. Donovan's operational sketches and Parker's synchronized traces were forwarded to research teams in the United States, where engineers began to think about making altimeter-derived anomaly detection an explicit capability rather than an improvised trick. But in the theater, the method's immediate worth lay in its practicality. It was cheap, it used existing equipment, and, when performed correctly, it produced a usable cue where none had existed. As summer slipped into fall, Donovan's small tactical innovation had moved past the proof-of-concept stage. The method was being taught in flight briefings, added to pre-sweep checklists, and used in coordinated operations that combined detection runs with the specialist suppression teams. Pilots who had been skeptical at first began to accept the narrow provisional value of the spike. It didn't promise a kill. It promised a place to start. And in a war where hiding was part of the defense's survival, starting places were everything. The first thing that changed was scale. What had started as Donovan and Parker's controlled runs turned into coordinated packages, a detection element, a suppression team, and a reconnaissance follow-up. Donovan's Phantom would fly 2 or 3 prescribed radials over a contested corridor, execute the 200 to 250-foot dip at the prescribed ground speed window, typically 480 to 520 knots, and if the altimeter trace produced a repeatable 0.4 to 0.8 second transient, Parker would mark the inertial timecode and derive a rough position. That neighborhood, as they called it, was relayed immediately to the on-call Wild Weasel, or F-105 strike section. The Weasel, carrying anti-radiation munitions or specialized gunnery, would make a rapid, low-level hammer blow to the estimated grid. The reconnaissance team, usually a photo sortie at first light, would close the loop. It was a simple 3-step operational chain: probe, handoff, neutralize. Operational records from the 388th show how that chain worked in practice. In one representative engagement in August 1970, Donovan's crew produced 3 repeatable spikes along 2 radials east of a suspected coastal site. The Weasel flight launched immediately on the coordinates. The strike run found a radar dish concealed among tall trees. Morning aerial photography showed physical damage to the reflector and disruption of ancillary equipment. In subsequent weeks, similar sequences, dip, handoff, strike, recon, produced multiple confirmations in separate sectors. These were not one-off luck events. They were repeatable tactical outcomes that turned a pilot's trace into actionable intelligence. There were frictions and limits. The altimeter-derived fix was inherently coarse, typically a forward uncertainty of a few hundred meters at the speeds involved. That meant the handoff did not deliver a pinpoint. It gave a short list of likely emitter positions. The Weasels still had to do the hard work: approach, bait, and when the emitter lit, attack. In some cases, the Soviets and North Vietnamese adapted quickly. Emplacements learned to power up only briefly, rotate dishes irregularly, or use low-power pulses to reduce the probability of generating a usable perturbation in the altimeter band. In other places, they tried orienting dishes to reduce backscatter into aircraft approach corridors. That adaptation forced tactical evolution. Detection runs became sequences of angled dips, brief lateral offsets, and multiple passes to build corroboration. When detectors and defenders both change, the contest becomes a dynamic interplay, each side improving, each side improvising. Even so, Donovan's method earned quantifiable cup marks. Squadron debriefs compiled during the fall showed a noticeable improvement in suppression effectiveness where altimeter detection handoffs were used. Loss reports and strike assessments recorded a string of damaged or degraded radar sites in sectors where the method was systematically applied. More importantly, flight crews reported a measurable reduction in SAM engagements on routes that had been swept using the method in combination with conventional SIGINT and RWRQs. Those operational outcomes were conservative measures. No claim of total elimination was ever made, but the practical effect was clear. Detection runs helped shrink the enemy's safe operating envelope and gave strike planners higher confidence that suppression teams could find and neutralize hidden nodes before they fired. That practical theater success is what earned Donovan an audience with the technical community. He and Parker sent representative altimeter traces, synchronized film, and inertial fixes back to avionics labs in South Vietnam and to engineering teams in the United States. Analysts at the 7th Air Force Electronics Cell and at Wright-Patterson took the data seriously. They reproduced the phenomenon on oscilloscope rigs and instrumented test flights. Their conclusion was the same Donovan and Parker had reached in the field. Under the right geometry and frequency overlap, active enemy emitters would perturb the altimeter return in a characteristic way. The lab work added two valuable outcomes. First, it clarified which emitter types and beam geometries were most likely to produce the signature. Second, it suggested signal processing strategies that could make detection more robust. From those lab conversations came incremental but important innovations. Avionics shops fielded simple tape recording add-ons and later digital loggers that could capture altimeter returns at higher sample rates, making it easier to isolate transient spikes from terrain clutter. Signal analysts experimented with bandpass filters and matched filter techniques to improve the signal-to-noise ratio. On the operational side, doctrine evolved. Detection dips were incorporated as optional pre-sweep runs. Time code and film sync procedures were standardized to reduce position uncertainty. And combined missions, with SIGINT overlays, became the norm. In short order, the improvised dip had turned into a codified auxiliary detection procedure that frontline crews could use with confidence, and rules to prevent misuse or dangerous linger times were written into flight cards. The trick's influence extended beyond the immediate theater. The core idea, using a platform's existing sensors as an indirect detection method, helped motivate purpose-built passive sensor concepts. Engineers began exploring how to exploit crossband coupling and multipath signatures intentionally, leading to more systematic passive detection suites and smarter signal processing for anti-radiation tasks. Some of Donovan's traces and field notes were referenced in early design conversations about sensor fusion and passive correlation. How to combine a small altimeter-derived cue with other indicators to raise a confidence metric before committing a suppression asset. That conceptual lineage is not a direct line. There were many contributors to passive sensor evolution. But Donovan's work was a practical, operationally tested seed that engineers could point to when arguing for low-cost, high-payoff sensor exploitation. There was also, and importantly, a human legacy. Donovan's method reinforced a cultural lesson the Air Force had long prized. Tactical advantage often comes from marrying practical instinct to disciplined data. He had not ignored instruments. He had watched them closely and then devised a method to make them speak. That mindset, observe, test, codify, migrated into training. Flight briefings began including annotated altimeter traces as a learning tool. New crews practiced the dip on ranges, learned to cross-check spikes, and trained on coordinated handoff protocols. The result was a cadre of pilots who could treat the aircraft's sensors as both safety instruments and tactical probes. By the time Donovan rotated home, the technique had been used in several theaters of operation and had produced dozens of handoffs that led to follow-up strikes or reconnaissance confirmations. It never solved the SAM problem, nothing single-handedly could, but it added a layer of sensory redundancy that increased survivability for a generation of crews. In the broader sweep of aviation technology, the method contributed to a growing appreciation that sensors could be repurposed by clever operators. It helped push efforts to make altimeter and other avionics traces more accessible to onboard processing, a precursor, at least conceptually, to later passive detection and sensor fusion initiatives. In the last record Donovan filed before leaving theater, he wrote a terse summary. Antenna lobes and environment can be interrogated by aircraft motion. Altimeter returns provide a narrow cue window. Use with corroboration only. Do not rely alone. That sentence captured the ethos of what he had done. Small, disciplined, and always backed by data. The Phantom's altimeter spikes did not make headlines. They did not win medals or fill news feeds. But for crews who flew low and hard over a defended landscape, those half-second blips were often the difference between making the phone call that started a coordinated suppression run or becoming another anonymous loss. A captain's curiosity had translated into a tactic that saved missions and, in some cases, lives, and leaving behind lessons that engineers and tacticians would refine for years to come. Thanks for listening till the end. I put a lot of effort to bring you factually correct and lesser-known stories of the past. Subscribe my channel if you like this type of content.